Hi, I'm Captain Olivia Reeves. 2 years ago, my parents invited me to their 35th anniversary celebration just to tell me I was their greatest regret, in front of everyone. They said joining the military ruined my life. What they didn't know was that I'd just been promoted to command my own helicopter unit, and I'd flown missions that saved hundreds of lives. Before we continue, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. This story? It changed everything. It was a perfect New England June afternoon, the kind where the air is warm but not humid, and the sky is that impossible shade of blue that makes you believe in second chances. I remember smoothing down my dress uniform as I drove down the winding maple-lined driveway to my parents' estate in Westport, Connecticut. The collar felt stiff against my neck, the brass buttons catching afternoon light as I adjusted the rearview mirror. I shouldn't have come. That thought circled in my mind like the hawks riding thermals above the property. But after 8 years of minimal contact, postcards from deployment, perfunctory holiday calls, and the occasional strained video chat, I'd convinced myself things could be different, that somehow time had softened the edges of our estrangement. Mom had called personally to invite me. "It would mean a lot to your father," she'd said, her voice carrying that familiar note of expectation. "The whole family will be there. Your brother Andrew is flying in from San Francisco with his wife and the twins." A pause. "We'd like to have all our children present." Children, not disappointments, not mistakes. For a moment, the word felt like an olive branch. I parked behind a row of luxury cars, German sedans and Italian sports cars that belonged to my parents' friends, local executives and old money families who had known me since I was a girl with skinned knees and impossible dreams. Dreams that never included Ivy League business schools or law firms or marrying into the right family. The only futures my parents had ever imagined for me. The celebration was in full swing as I walked across the sprawling lawn toward the white tent that glowed in the late afternoon sun. Laughter spilled out along with the sounds of a string quartet. Waiters in crisp black and white weaved through clusters of guests carrying flutes of champagne and trays of hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than a week of my military salary. Debated wearing civilian clothes, the blue dress that hung in my closet for rare formal occasions, maybe. But something inside me refused to hide who I'd become. So I wore my full army dress uniform, ribbons and all, my captain's bars catching the light. My hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, not a strand out of place. I stood straighter in this uniform than I ever had in the designer dresses my mother used to buy me. Conversations paused as I entered the tent. Eyes darted my way, some with surprise, others with that uniquely New England blend of judgment barely concealed by politeness. And there, at the center of it all, stood my parents. My mother, Catherine, still beautiful at 60, her silver-streaked hair swept into an elegant chignon, wearing a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. My father, Richard, commanding as ever in his tailored suit, his hand resting on the small of my mother's back in that possessive way he had. My brother Andrew spotted me first. He looked like our father's clone in his bespoke suit, successful, and secure in a way I'd never be in their eyes. He whispered something to my mother, whose smile faltered as she turned to see me. For a moment, no one moved. Then my mother broke away from my father and approached me, her heels clicking against the wooden dance floor. "Olivia," she said, air kissing near my cheek. "We didn't know if you'd make it." I felt the stiffness in her embrace, how she held herself, slightly away from my uniform as if it might leave a stain on her designer dress. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, the lie sticking in my throat. "Congratulations on 35 years. My father approached then, martini in hand. His eyes swept over my uniform with the same assessing gaze he used for business acquisitions that weren't quite measuring up. "Military still treating you well?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. Andrew just closed a deal with that tech startup I told you about. 30 million, board position included. He clapped my brother on the shoulder. Chip off the old block. I swallowed the familiar bile of never being enough. Congratulations, Andrew. My brother at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Thanks, Liv. How's everything? Before I could answer, my mother cut in. Olivia, you remember the Whitmores? Their son Ethan just made partner at Goldman. He's here somewhere. Her eyes scanned the crowd, already planning an introduction, still trying to fix me after all these years. Mom, I'm not interested in 31 and still single, she continued as if I hadn't spoken. When are you going to start thinking about a real life, Olivia? You can't fly helicopters forever. Actually, I love my life, I said, but she had already turned to greet another guest, my words evaporating in the space between us. A waiter passed with champagne, and I took a glass, needing something to do with my hands. I felt eyes on me. My second cousin Melanie, who'd warned me not to throw my life away when I'd announced my plans to attend West Point instead of Dartmouth. My father's business partner Howard, who'd once drunkenly told me that women in combat positions were asking for trouble. My Aunt Sylvia, who still sent me job listings for executive assistant positions at her husband's firm, as if I might suddenly realize the error of my ways. I retreated to the edge of the tent, watching as my parents circulated among their guests. They were good at this, working a room, making everyone feel special. Everyone except me. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Sergeant Martinez. All set for tomorrow, Captain? Weather looks clear for the demonstration flight? I smiled, typing back quickly. All systems go. Tell the team I'll be there at 0600. In less than 24 hours, I'd be back where I belonged, in the cockpit of my Blackhawk, leading my unit in a demonstration for a congressional delegation. The thought steadied me as another wave of laughter rippled through the party, a joke I wasn't part of. There's the soldier girl. The voice belonged to my Uncle Richard Jr., already red-faced from too many scotches. He lumbered toward me, drink, sloshing. Still playing with helicopters, huh? Thought you'd have grown out of that by now. It's not playing, Uncle Rich. It's my career. Career, he scoffed. That's what they're calling it now? Your cousin James has a career, cardiac surgeon at Mass General. 3 kids, house on the Cape. What do you have, a bunk in some barracks? I command 35 soldiers and 8 aircraft, I said, heat rising to my face. And I have an apartment in Alexandria. He waved his hand dismissively. Such a waste. Pretty girl like you should be married by now, giving your parents some grandkids, not running around war zones with a bunch of jarheads. Those are Marines, Uncle Rich. I'm Army. I swallowed the rest of my retort. There was no point. He'd never understand the life I'd built, the respect I'd earned, the bond I shared with my unit. He'd never understand how it felt to lift a helicopter into the darkness, navigating by instruments alone, knowing lives depended on your skill and nerve. The dinner bell chimed, saving me from further conversation. Guests began drifting toward the long tables set up beneath crystal chandeliers suspended improbably from the tent ceiling. Place cards guided everyone to their assigned seats. I found mine at the far end of the third table, wedged between a great-aunt I barely remembered and one of my father's golf partners. As the soup course arrived, my father rose, champagne flute in hand. Conversations hushed as he prepared to toast my mother. Catherine, he began, his voice carrying that boardroom authority. 35 years ago, you made me the luckiest man alive. He spoke about their journey together, the business they'd built, the home they'd created. He talked about their proudest achievements. And of course, our greatest joys. Our children. He turned, gesturing toward Andrew, our son, who exceeded every expectation, who carries on the Reeves legacy with such distinction. Andrew stood, accepting the accolades with a practiced smile and a raised glass. My father's eyes then swept the tables, finding me at the outskirts of the gathering. Something flickered across his face, disappointment, resignation. "And Olivia," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "our daughter who chose a different path." The pause was slight, but unmistakable. The tent grew quieter. "A path that frankly continues to baffle your mother and me." Murmurs rippled through the guests. My face burned, but I kept my expression neutral, the way I'd learned to do during dress-downs from superior officers. "Never let them see you sweat. We had such hopes," my father continued, as if I wasn't sitting right there, as if this was a eulogy rather than a toast at a celebration. "Princeton, Harvard Law perhaps, a suitable marriage. Instead," he gestured vaguely toward my uniform, "she chose this. Military service." He said it like I'd chosen to join a circus or a cult. My knuckles whitened around my water glass. "Catherine and I have tried to understand. We've waited for her to outgrow this phase. But here we are, years later, and our greatest disappointment remains that Olivia never became who she was meant to be." The tent fell completely silent. My great-aunt patted my hand sympathetically. Across the table, Andrew stared at his plate, unable to meet my eyes. "So tonight," my father concluded, "as we celebrate 35 years of building a legacy, we face the reality that not every investment yields the expected return. But we carry on. To 35 years, Catherine. I look forward to many more." Glasses raised. The toast continued. Conversation resumed. And I sat there, my soup growing cold, feeling as invisible as I had all those years ago when I'd announced my acceptance to West Point. But beneath the humiliation, something new kindled to life. A plan began to form, not of revenge exactly, but of something better. Something I could do to make them finally see me, really see me. Not just the disappointment, but the leader I'd become. I excused myself as dessert was being served, slipping out into the cool evening air. I walked to my car, the weight of their disapproval falling away with each step. I pulled out my phone and dialed Sergeant Martinez. "Change of plans for tomorrow," I said when she answered. "How do you feel about a slight detour on our demonstration flight?" I drove back to Fort Belvoir that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The trees along I-95 blurred into shadows as I pushed the speed limit, trying to outrun the humiliation that clung to me like smoke. My father's words echoed in my head with each mile marker. Our greatest disappointment. How many times had I heard some version of that sentiment? When I turned down Yale for West Point, when I chose aviation over military intelligence. Safer option my mother had suggested. When I deployed for the first time, and my father asked if I could at least try to get a desk job instead of flying combat missions. I'd made a career of exceeding expectations, just not theirs. The base welcomed me home with its familiar checkpoint, routines and ordered rows of buildings. I flashed my ID to the gate guard, a young specialist who snapped to attention when he recognized me. "Evening, Captain Reeves." His respect felt like oxygen after hours of suffocating disapproval. My apartment was small but mine, photographs of my unit on the walls instead of the debutante portraits my mother had once framed. Medals and citations hung where my parents might have placed Ivy League diplomas. A worn leather flight jacket draped over a chair instead of designer labels. I kicked off my dress shoes and changed out of my uniform, then poured myself a glass of whiskey. Not the expensive kind my father collected, but the kind my crew shared after difficult missions. As I sipped it, I pulled out my laptop and opened my flight plans for tomorrow's congressional demonstration. Our unit had been selected to showcase the Army's latest medevac protocols and equipment innovations. It was an honor, a recognition of the work we'd done during our last deployment. 3 members of the House Armed Services Committee would be observing, along with a general from the Pentagon. A routine flight path was already approved. Departure. From Fort Belvoir, demonstration over the Quantico training grounds, return to base. But my parents' anniversary party had changed things. Now I had a point to prove. I pulled up Google Maps and found my parents' Westport address. It was a 300-mile flight from Virginia, well within our Black Hawk's range. The demonstration wasn't scheduled until 1400 hours. If we left early, we could make a slight detour on our way to Quantico. I picked up my phone and texted Sergeant Martinez again. Meet me at the hangar at 0500, bringing breakfast. Need to discuss route changes. Her reply came immediately. Roger. That, Captain? Everything okay? I didn't answer. I couldn't explain what I was feeling. This mix of rage and determination and something deeper, a need to be seen by the people who had spent a lifetime looking past me. Sleep came in restless bursts. That night, I dreamed of falling, of flying through storms, of my father standing on the lawn looking up at me with that same disappointment as I hovered above him, rotors whipping the manicured grass into chaos. I woke before my alarm, showered, and dressed, in my flight suit. The olive green fabric felt like armor after the vulnerability of the previous evening. I stopped for coffee and a box of donuts on my way to the base, the normalcy of the errand grounding me as dawn broke over Alexandria. The airfield was quiet when I arrived, just the distant sound of an early patrol returning and the hum of ground equipment. My Black Hawk waited on the tarmac, its sleek profile silhouetted against the lightening sky. UH-60M, tail number 24726, call sign Mercy 1. We'd been through 3 deployments together, this helicopter and I. It had never let me down, never judged my choices, never found me wanting. I ran my hand along its side as I approached, a habit I'd developed early in my career. Some pilots had pre-flight rituals, lucky coins or prayers. I had this moment of connection with the machine that carried me above the world. Sergeant Elena Martinez was already there, clipboard in hand, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. At 28, she was one of the best crew chiefs I'd ever worked with. Methodical, unflappable, with an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical issues before they became problems. Morning, Captain, she said, accepting the coffee. I handed her. Flight plan changes? I took a deep breath. I want to make a stop on our way to Quantico. Her eyebrow raised slightly, but she didn't question me. Where to? Westport, Connecticut. I pulled out my tablet and showed her the map I'd marked. My parents' house, specifically. Now both eyebrows went up. That's not exactly on the, way to Quantico. No, I agreed. It's not. She waited, sipping her coffee. Martinez had been with me through enough to know when to push and when to let me find my own words. My parents held their 35th anniversary party last night, I finally said. I attended. It didn't go well. Understanding dawned in her eyes. She'd heard me take enough terse phone calls from my family over the years to guess the rest. And... You want to... What? Buzz their house? Something like that. I handed her a donut. Look, I know it sounds petty. With all due respect, Captain, you've earned some petty. She took a bite of the donut, thinking, but why bring the whole crew? This seems personal. I leaned against the helicopter, looking out at the runway, where the early light was turning the asphalt gold. Because it's not just about me, I said finally. It's about all of us. What we do. The lives we save. My father called my career a phase last night, like I've been playing soldier for the last decade instead of serving my country. Martinez nodded slowly. So this is about showing him what you really do. What we do, I corrected. My parents have never seen me fly. They've never met my crew. They've never understood that this isn't just a job I took to rebel against their Ivy League plans. It's who I am. She considered this, her expression thoughtful. The congressional demonstration is at 1400. If we leave by 0700, we could make the detour and still be at Quantico on time. Exactly what I was thinking. Does the colonel know about this side trip? I hesitated. Not yet. I'll file an amended flight plan. Training exercise. She didn't look convinced. And if he asks for specifics? Low-level navigation in unfamiliar residential terrain. Valuable experience for the newer pilots. I met her gaze steadily. I'm not asking the crew to lie, Martinez. Just to take a slight detour, one that matters to me. She finished her coffee and crumpled the cup. You know we'd follow you anywhere, Captain. The crew respects you. If this is important to you, we're in. Relief washed through me. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said with a hint of a smile. Let's see if we can pull this off without giving the FAA a heart attack. Flying a military helicopter over Connecticut suburbs isn't exactly standard. Procedure. The rest of the crew arrived within the hour. 2 pilots, our medic, and the door gunner who would be demonstrating equipment for the congressional delegation. I briefed them on the modified flight plan, keeping the explanation professional. A navigation exercise in varied terrain, I called it. An opportunity to demonstrate the Black Hawk's versatility. If they suspected there was more to it, they didn't say so. That was the thing about my unit. They trusted me. Not because I was perfect or infallible, but because I'd earned it, mission by mission, year by year. The kind of trust my family had never given me. We completed pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. The mechanics gave their final clearances. The weather reports confirmed ideal flying conditions up the eastern seaboard, clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility. Like the universe was conspiring to make my improvised plan possible. At 0700 sharp, I strapped into the pilot's seat and put on my flight helmet. The familiar weight of it centered me, the slight pressure against my temples bringing clarity. I ran through the startup sequence, the helicopter responding to my commands with its usual precision. The rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. The distinctive whump 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 building as they reached operating speed. Mercy 1 to tower, requesting clearance for takeoff, I said into my mic. Tower to Mercy 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is 050 at 6 knots. I eased the collective up, feeling the helicopter lighten as it broke contact with the ground. We hovered for a moment, everything in balance. Then I tilted the cyclic forward and we moved ahead, climbing into the morning sky. The base fell away beneath us, buildings shrinking to model size. Martinez's voice came through my headset. Flight plan is logged, Captain. ETA to Westport is 0845 if we maintain current speed. Roger that, I replied, banking north. Let's give the new guys some experience with terrain following on the way. For yai. The next hour, I lost myself in the rhythm of flight. This was where I had always felt most at home. Not in my parents' carefully decorated rooms, not in the social circles they had tried to force me into, but here, moving through 3 dimensions, making split-second calculations, feeling the aircraft respond to my touch. We flew over the patchwork of Maryland farmland, then the more densely populated regions of New Jersey. The morning sun glinted off rivers and highways below. In my headset, the crew maintained professional chatter, calling out landmarks and discussing the upcoming demonstration. No one asked about the detour, though I caught Martinez watching, me during a routine instrument check, her expression questioning. As we approached the Connecticut border, I felt my heart rate increasing. The closer we got to Westport, the more I questioned what I was doing. Was I really going to fly a military helicopter over my parents' anniversary brunch? Was I that desperate for their acknowledgement? Captain, Martinez's voice cut through my thoughts. We're 20 minutes out from the coordinates you provided. I swallowed hard. Roger that. Let's descend to 1,000 feet for better visibility. Weather radar shows some guests might be getting an early wake-up call, she added. Her tone carefully neutral. Ground fog's burned off already. Translation. My parents and their guests would be able to see us clearly. Good. As we crossed into Fairfield County, the landscape changed to the familiar rolling hills and dense woodlands of my childhood. Sprawling estates nestled between old-growth forests, the houses getting larger and more ostentatious as we approached the coast. One thing about flying, it put wealth in perspective. From 1,000 feet up, even the grandest mansion looked like a doll's house. 5 minutes to destination, Martinez announced. I adjusted our heading slightly, following the mental map I'd created. Left at the golf course, straight past the country club where I'd endured countless junior cotillions, then right at the stone church where my parents renewed their vows every 10 years like clockwork. And there it was. The Reeves estate, 5 acres of perfectly landscaped grounds surrounding the colonial-style mansion where I'd grown up. Even from the air, I could see that the anniversary celebration continued. Cars parked along the circular driveway, white tents still standing on the back lawn, tiny figures moving about. A brunch, most likely. My parents loved their elaborate weekend brunches, with imported champagne and a chef brought in to make crepes to order. Another opportunity to showcase their perfect life. I hovered the helicopter just offshore, looking down at the scene. From this height, I could see the swimming pool where I'd learned to dive, the tennis courts where my father had tried to groom me for the country club championships, the garden where my mother hosted her charity luncheons. None of it had ever felt like it belonged to me. That's the target? Martinez asked, following my gaze. I nodded, not trusting my voice. What's the plan, Captain? I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of the controls in my hands, the vibration of the helicopter around me. My crew was waiting. My helicopter was ready. This moment, at least, was entirely mine. Let's show them what their disappointment can do, I said, banking the Black Hawk toward the estate. Mercy 1, prepare for approach. I guided the Black Hawk lower, feeling the aircraft respond to my touch like an extension of my body. The estate grew larger beneath us, details sharpening into focus. The copper weather vane on the garage that my grandfather had installed, the stone path winding through my mother's prized rose garden, the massive oak tree where I'd once built, a fort that my father dismantled because it ruined the landscape aesthetic. Tightening approach pattern, I announced to my crew. Standard observation formation. My co-pilot, Lieutenant Walker, gave me a sidelong glance but kept his tone professional. Roger that, Captain. Maintaining 800 feet AGL. The headset crackled. With Martinez's voice. Captain, I'm seeing movement on the ground. Looks like we've been noticed. I smiled behind my oxygen mask. Good. That was the point. Below us, tiny figures emerged from the white tent, faces tilted skyward. I could almost imagine the conversation, the startled exclamations, the confusion, my mother's irritation at having her perfectly orchestrated brunch interrupted. They wouldn't know it was me, not yet. To them, we were just a military helicopter inexplicably flying over their exclusive neighborhood. Circle once, I instructed. Then we'll drop down for a closer look. I banked the Black Hawk into a wide turn, giving the guests a full view of the aircraft. Mercy 1 was an impressive sight, especially to civilians who'd never seen a military helicopter up close. 40 feet long, sleek and dangerous looking with its weapons mounts and specialized equipment. The Red Cross markings on the side identified us as a medevac unit, but the overall effect was still intimidating. As we completed our circle, I spotted my father on the back terrace, hand shielding his eyes as he stared upward. Even from this height, I recognized his stance, feet planted wide, shoulders squared, the posture of a man accustomed to controlling his environment. Except he couldn't control this. He couldn't control me. Taking us down to 400 feet, I announced, easing the collective. Prepare for low hover. The Black Hawk descended smoothly, rotors churning the air. Below us, the manicured lawn began to ripple with the downwash, cocktail napkins and light decorations from the party scattering in the artificial wind. Guests retreated toward the house, hands pressed against billowing clothes, hair whipping around their faces. I positioned us directly over the back lawn, close enough that they could see the details of our aircraft, close enough that the noise would make conversation impossible, close enough that there could be no mistaking the deliberate nature of our presence. "Holding position," I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't about revenge, it was about visibility, about finally being seen on my terms. Martinez's voice came through my headset again. "Captain, I think you've made your point. FAA might have something to say about this." She was right, of course. What I was doing wasn't exactly by the book, but I needed one more moment. "Preparing to land," I announced. "Land?" Walker's head snapped toward me. "On the property?" I nodded. "There's sufficient clearance on the south lawn. I've assessed the terrain." Of course I had. I'd spent my childhood mapping escape routes from that house, calculating distances, planning getaways. I knew every inch of the grounds, including the flat expanse of grass where my father had once planned to build a reflecting pool, a project abandoned when the landscape architect couldn't match his impossible vision. "Captain," Walker began, his tone cautious, "I'm not sure that's—" "Trust me, Lieutenant," I said firmly. "I know what I'm doing." I guided the Black Hawk lower, feeling the familiar sensations of a landing approach, the slight increase in vibration, the way the controls became more responsive as we entered ground effect. Below, the party guests had retreated to the safety of the terrace, all except my father, who stood his ground at the edge of the lawn, face upturned, expression unreadable from this height. The helicopter settled gently onto the grass, rotors, still spinning at idle speed, creating a circle of flattened lawn around us. Through the windscreen, I could see my father's face now, the shock and disbelief as recognition dawned. Behind him, my mother emerged from the crowd, hand pressed to her mouth. "Maintain power," I instructed Walker. "This is a hot landing. I'll be 2 minutes." "Roger that," he replied, still looking uncertain but following orders. I unstrapped and removed my helmet, handing it to Martinez. "Watch my back," I said quietly. She nodded, understanding more than I'd said aloud. I stepped out onto the skid, then dropped to the ground, ducking under the still spinning rotors with practiced ease. The noise was tremendous, the whump, whump, whump of the blades, the whine of the engines, the sound of power and purpose drowning out the genteel murmurs of my parents' world. I straightened and walked forward, away from the downwash, my flight. Suit crisp and professional, my movements confident. This was my element, not theirs. For once, they were the ones who didn't belong. My father started toward me, his face a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, embarrassment. I could read the thoughts written across his features. What is she doing? How dare she? What will everyone think? I stopped 10 feet from him, just outside easy conversation distance. The rotor noise meant he would have to shout to be heard, would have to work to communicate with me for once. "Olivia!" he yelled, gesturing wildly at the helicopter. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked past him at the gathered crowd. My mother's friends in their summer dresses and pearls. My father's business associates with their practiced smiles now frozen in shock. My brother Andrew standing slightly apart, his expression unreadable. "This," I finally said, raising my voice to carry over the noise, "is what disappointment looks like." My father's face reddened. "Get that thing off my lawn! You're making a scene!" "I'm making a point," I replied, stepping closer. "You called my career a phase last night. You dismissed what I do as if it were a teenage rebellion. This is what I do, Dad. I fly one of the most advanced aircraft in the world. I lead a team of elite soldiers. I save lives." He glanced nervously at the watching crowd, then back at me. "We can discuss this privately, not like this." "Why not like this?" I gestured to the helicopter behind me. "You were comfortable humiliating me in front of your friends. Why shouldn't they see who I really am?" My mother appeared at his side, her face tight with controlled fury. Olivia, people are staring. This is completely inappropriate. Do you know what we did on our last deployment? I continued, ignoring her. We evacuated 27 wounded soldiers under enemy fire. We flew night missions into terrain so dangerous most civilian pilots wouldn't attempt it in broad daylight. 3 of those soldiers would have died without our team. I pointed back at the helicopter. That crew? They follow me because they respect me, because I've earned it. Not because of our family name, not because of where I went to school, but because of who I am and what I can do. The crowd had grown silent, straining to hear over the noise of the rotors. I caught glimpses of different expressions now, not just shock, but curiosity, interest, even a flash of what might have been respect from one of my father's older colleagues. Is this what it takes to make you see me? I asked, my voice softer now, though still loud enough to carry. Do I need to literally land a military helicopter on your lawn for you to acknowledge that my choices have value? Something shifted. In my father's expression, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of doubt. Before he could speak, Martinez appeared at my side. Captain, she said, we need to maintain our timeline if we're going to make it to Quantico. I nodded. I'll be right there. She gave my parents a measuring look, then walked back to the helicopter, her posture military precise. Who was that? My mother asked, her social reflexes momentarily overriding her anger. That's Sergeant Elena Martinez, I said. My crew chief, one of the finest soldiers I've ever worked with. She saved my life twice. My father's eyes followed Martinez, then returned to me. Olivia, he began, his voice different now, less certain. What exactly are you trying to prove here? I'm not trying to prove anything anymore, I said. I'm showing you what you've refused to see. This is who I am. This is what I've built. Your disappointment says more about you than it ever did about me. I turned to leave, but he caught my arm. Wait, this is insanity. You can't just drop in like this and then leave. I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. Actually, I can. I have a congressional demonstration to conduct. My unit is showcasing emergency medical evacuations for members of the Armed Services Committee this afternoon. His eyebrows rose slightly. Congressional? Yes, I said, allowing myself a small smile. Turns out your disappointing daughter is doing work important enough that Congress wants to see it. For the first time in my adult life, I saw something close to uncertainty in my father's eyes. I didn't know. You never asked. My mother stepped forward. You could have told us. I laughed, a short, sharp sound. When? Between being told I'm wasting my potential and hearing about Andrew's latest business triumph? You weren't interested? In my successes, only in the ways I failed to meet your expectations. Behind me, Walker flashed the landing lights briefly, our signal that we needed to leave. I gave a short nod of acknowledgement. I have to go, I said. Olivia, my father began, then stopped, seeming genuinely at a loss for words. I looked at them both, the parents who had shaped me for better and worse. The mother whose approval I'd craved, the father whose respect I'd never earned. They looked smaller somehow, standing on their perfect lawn with their perfect lives, unable to comprehend the world I'd built beyond their walls. I'm not asking for your understanding anymore, I said. I'm not even asking for your approval. I just wanted you to see me, really see me, for once. I turned and walked back to the helicopter, ducking under the rotors and climbing aboard with practiced ease. Martinez handed me my helmet, her expression asking if I was okay. I nodded, strapping myself back into the pilot's seat. Through the windscreen, I could see my parents still standing on the lawn, watching. Around them, party guests had crept back out onto the terrace, phones raised to capture the moment. My brother had moved closer to my parents, one hand on my mother's shoulder. Ready for takeoff, I said into my mic, running through the sequence. with automatic precision. Mercy One preparing to depart. The engines increased their pitch as I raised the collective, feeling the helicopter lighten as it broke contact with the ground. We hovered for a moment, 10 feet above the lawn, rotors spinning a circle of chaos into my parents' ordered world. My father raised a hand, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement. I didn't wave back. Instead, I eased the cyclic forward, and we moved ahead, climbing away from the estate, banking south toward our original destination. Resuming flight plan to Quantico, I announced, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. ETA 13:30 hours. No one spoke immediately. Then Martinez's voice came through my headset, warm with something that might have been pride. Nice landing, Captain. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crew, breaking the tension. I allowed myself a small smile, feeling the weight of decades beginning to lift from my shoulders as we left Westport behind. How do you think your father's going to explain? A Black Hawk landing to his country club friends? Walker asked, grinning. Let him figure it out, I replied, banking the helicopter toward the rising sun. I've got more important things to do. Below us, the landscape unfolded, first the manicured wealth of Fairfield County, then the denser urban sprawl of New York's outskirts, eventually giving way to the open countryside of New Jersey. With each mile, I felt myself breathing easier, the tightness in my chest loosening. I hadn't gone there for forgiveness or reconciliation. I'd gone to be seen, finally, on my own terms, to show them the reality they'd dismissed for so long. Whether they understood or not wasn't the point anymore. Captain, Martinez said after we'd been flying in companionable silence for several minutes, for what it's worth, I think your parents just got a pretty good education. I glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. About who their daughter really is, she clarified. I nodded slowly, turning back to the horizon. Maybe, I said, but that's not why we did this. No? Walker asked. No, I said firmly. We did it because we have a congressional demonstration to perform, and I thought a little navigation exercise would be good practice. They knew it wasn't. True, but they accepted the fiction with the loyalty I'd come to expect from my crew. Martinez even played along. Excellent terrain variations, Captain. Very educational. As we continued south, I found myself thinking not about my parents or their reaction, but about the demonstration ahead, about the lives we'd saved during our last deployment, about the team that trusted me to lead them. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the shadow of my family's disappointment. I felt the sun on my face through the windscreen, the vibration of a perfectly tuned aircraft responding to my commands, the certainty of knowing exactly where I belonged. I was Captain Olivia Reeves, medevac pilot, unit commander. My parents' opinion of my choices hadn't changed who I was. It had only ever changed how I felt about it. And now, flying away from Westport with my crew beside me and my mission ahead, I finally understood. I didn't need them to be proud of me. I was proud of myself, and that was enough. The Quantico demonstration went flawlessly. Our team executed the complex medical evacuation sequence with the precision that had become our hallmark. The rapid descent into the simulated hot zone, the medics deploying while Walker and I maintained a hover just 4 feet off the ground, Martinez coordinating the loading of the casualties under the still spinning rotors, then our swift extraction and transport to the field medical station. The congressional delegation watched from a covered observation area, accompanied by General Harris and several high-ranking Pentagon officials. I could feel their evaluating gazes as we worked, but my mind was clear, my hands steady on the controls. After the emotional intensity of the Westport landing, this felt almost easy, a return to the familiar rhythm of doing what I did best. As we shut down the engines after the final demonstration run, Martinez leaned close to me, her voice pitched low so only I could hear. "You're 6 o'clock, Captain. VIP approaching." I turned to see General Harris escorting one of the congressional representatives toward our helicopter. a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing a tailored pantsuit despite the June heat. Representative Eleanor Blackwood, chair of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. I recognized her from briefing materials we'd received about the demonstration. I stepped forward, saluting crisply. Representative Blackwood, General Harris. At ease, Captain, the general said, returning my salute. The representative has some questions about your unit's capabilities. Representative Blackwood extended her hand, her grip firm. Impressive work today, Captain Reeves. Your team's coordination was exceptional. Thank you, ma'am. They're the best at what they do. She nodded, studying me with shrewd eyes. Walk with me a moment, would you? I'd like to hear more about your experience with these new evacuation protocols. I glanced at General Harris, who gave a slight nod of approval. Of course, ma'am. We moved away from the helicopter, walking along the edge of the training area. The June sun beat down on the tarmac, creating heat waves that shimmered in the distance. Representative Blackwood seemed unbothered by the temperature, her stride purposeful. I'll be direct, Captain, she said once we were out of earshot. I've been pushing for increased funding for medical evacuation units, particularly those implementing these advanced protocols. Today's demonstration will help make that case. She paused, glancing sideways at me. But I'm also interested in the human element, the soldiers who make these missions possible. I nodded, unsure where she was headed. Your file crossed my desk last month, she continued. West Point graduate, distinguished service in Afghanistan and Syria, multiple commendations for evacuations, under fire. Her lips curved in a slight smile. And now I hear you made quite an impression in Westport, Connecticut this morning. My steps faltered. Ma'am? She laughed, a short, dry sound. Military aviation in civilian airspace gets noticed, Captain. Especially when it involves a Black Hawk landing on Richard Reeves's estate during what I understand was quite the society event. Heat crept up my neck. I can explain. She held up a hand. No need. Richard Reeves and I serve on the board of the Metropolitan Museum together. He's an insufferable ass when it comes to his children, always going on about his son's business acumen while dismissing his daughter's military service. Her eyes met mine, knowing and sharp. I didn't realize until today that you were that daughter. I swallowed, uncertain how to respond. My career flashed before my eyes. The reprimand that would surely come. The potential disciplinary action. For the unauthorized landing. Relax, Captain, Representative Blackwood said, reading my expression. I'm not here to reprimand you. Quite the opposite. I don't understand. She stopped walking, turning to face me directly. I grew up in a similar world to yours. Expectations, traditions, predetermined paths. I was supposed to marry well and host dinner parties, not run for Congress. Her voice took on a reflective quality. My father didn't speak to me for 3 years after I announced my first campaign. I studied her, seeing her differently now, not just as a powerful congressional representative, but as someone who might actually understand. 5 years into my first term, she continued, I was up for an important committee assignment, and that father fell ill, pancreatic cancer. During one of my hospital visits, he told me he'd finally watched me speak on the House floor via C-SPAN. She smiled slightly at the memory. He said, I still don't understand why you chose this life, Ellie. But you're damn good at it. The parallel wasn't lost on me. Did that fix everything between you? No, she said frankly. But it was a beginning. Sometimes that's all we get. She resumed walking, and I fell into step beside her. The point is, Captain, I respect what you did today, both here and in Westport. You showed your family who you are, on your terms, and you showed me and my colleagues exactly why this program deserves continued funding. Relief washed through me, followed quickly by suspicion. Is there something specific you want from me, Representative? She laughed again, more genuinely this time. Direct, I like that. She gestured toward the observation area, where the other officials were preparing to depart. What I want is for you to consider a temporary assignment. 3 months at the Pentagon, working with my committee on next-generation medevac protocols and equipment requirements. We need someone with actual field experience to cut through the bureaucratic nonsense. I blinked, surprised. That's not what I was expecting. I'm sure it isn't, she agreed. But it's where you're needed right now. Your perspective is valuable. Captain, more valuable than you might realize. We had reached the edge of the tarmac. General Harris was watching us from a distance, his expression curious. Think about it, Representative Blackwood said. Talk to your commanding officer. I've already discussed the possibility with General Harris. The paperwork can be ready by next week. She extended her hand again. And Captain? That landing in Westport? Between us, I wish I could have seen Richard Reeves's face. With that, she turned and walked back toward the waiting officials, leaving me standing in the heat, my thoughts spinning. Martinez found me there a few minutes later, her expression questioning. Everything okay, Captain? I nodded slowly. I think so. Just not what I expected from today. Join the club, she said dryly. When you said we were taking a detour this morning, I didn't think it meant putting on an air show for Connecticut's old money set. I couldn't help laughing. Not exactly standard operating procedure, was it? No, ma'am, she agreed, her tone serious but her eyes warm. But sometimes non-standard is exactly what's needed. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of debriefings and equipment checks. By the time we lifted off from Quantico to return to Fort Belvoir, the sun was starting to lower in the west, casting long shadows across the landscape. I flew automatically, my mind still processing the day's events, the confrontation with my parents, the successful demonstration, Representative Blackwood's unexpected offer. Back at base, after the post-flight checks were complete and the crew dismissed, I found myself lingering in the hangar, reluctant to leave. The massive space was quiet now, just the occasional metallic ping of cooling engines and the distant sound of the evening patrol preparing for takeoff. I ran my hand along Mercy One's fuselage, feeling the smooth metal still warm from the day's flights. Thought I'd find you here? I turned to see Colonel Jenkins, my battalion commander, walking toward me. Tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. He'd been a mentor to me since my first days at Fort Belvoir. Sir? I straightened, suddenly aware that I was likely in for a reprimand about the Westport incident. He waved a hand. At ease, Reeves. This isn't official. I relaxed slightly, though wariness remained. Jenkins wasn't known for casual conversations. He stopped beside me, looking up at the helicopter. Heard you had an eventful day. Yes, sir. No. Point denying it. The demonstration went well. General Harris was impressed. Thank you, sir. Jenkins was quiet for a moment, still studying the Black Hawk. He also mentioned an unscheduled stop in Connecticut. Here it comes, I thought, bracing myself. Want to tell me about that? His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. I took a deep breath. It was personal, sir. A detour to my parents' home. I wanted them to see what I do, who I am. He nodded slowly. And did they? I'm not sure, I admitted. But I think maybe they started to. Jenkins turned to look at me then, his expression thoughtful. My daughter's a climate scientist, works on glaciers in Greenland half the year, about as far from my military life as you can get. I blinked, surprised by the personal revelation. In 3 years under his command, he'd rarely mentioned his family. Took me a long time to understand her choices, he continued. Even longer to respect them. Parents can be blind that way. Yes, sir. You made quite an impression on Representative Blackwood, he said, changing the subject abruptly. She's requested you specifically for this Pentagon assignment. She mentioned it, I said cautiously. I wasn't sure how to respond. Jenkins smiled slightly. It's a good opportunity, Reeves. Visibility with people who make decisions about funding and equipment. The kind of assignment that advances careers. But it's not flying, I said, unable to keep the resistance from my voice. It's not what I'm trained to do. No, he agreed. It's not. It's harder. It's translating what you know, what you've lived through, into language bureaucrats can understand. It's fighting with memos and meetings instead of throttles and controls. He paused. It's making sure the next generation of medevac pilots has better equipment, better protocols, better support than you did. Put that way, it was difficult to argue against. Did General Harris mention the incident at my parents' house? I asked, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jenkins' expression gave nothing away. He said there was an unscheduled training exercise over Fairfield County. Relief washed through me. Then I caught the gleam in his eye. Of course, he continued. The FAA report was a bit more specific. Unauthorized landing of military aircraft on private property. Creation of noise disturbance in a residential area. Several violations of flight regulations. My stomach dropped. Sir, I already handled. He cut me off. Training exercise documentation has been filed retroactively. Necessary permissions obtained. Consider it a graduation present. Graduation? From thinking your value comes from other people's approval? He looked at me directly now. You're a damn good pilot, Reeves. One of the best I've commanded. But you've always had this hesitation. This need to prove yourself. Today, I think you finally did. To yourself. I stood straighter, understanding what he meant. Yes, sir. I think maybe I did. Good. He nodded once, decisively. Now, about this Pentagon assignment, I need your answer by Monday. If you accept, you'll need to brief Captain Rodriguez on taking over the unit temporarily. I'll think about it, I promised. Jenkins turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Reeves. Your father called the base commander this afternoon. My breath caught. He did? Apparently, he wanted to verify that his daughter really is considered one of the Army's top medevac pilots. Jenkins' mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Colonel Barrett assured him that Captain Olivia Reeves's reputation is well earned. Something shifted in my chest. Not quite joy, not quite vindication, but a quiet easing of a tension I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. Thank you for telling me, sir. Jenkins nodded. Get some rest, Captain. You've earned it. As he walked away, I turned back to the helicopter, running my hand along its side one more time. In the morning, I would call Representative Blackwood and accept the Pentagon assignment. Not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was where I could make the most difference. For now, though, I stood in the quiet hangar, feeling the day's events settling into perspective. I'd flown to my parents' house seeking recognition, but somewhere between Westport and Quantico, I'd stopped needing it. The validation I'd sought for so long had been with me all along, in the trust of my crew, the respect of my commanders, the lives we'd saved together, and in the end, that was the only recognition that truly mattered. The Pentagon was nothing like flying. For the first week of my temporary assignment, I felt like I was suffocating under fluorescent lights and PowerPoint presentations. The endless meetings, the bureaucratic language, the subtle power plays between officers and officials. It was a different kind of battlefield, and I wasn't sure I had the right weapons. My office was a windowless box in the E-ring, barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs. The walls were bare except for a map of global medevac operations and my framed West Point diploma. I'd hesitated to bring personal items, not wanting to settle in too comfortably. This wasn't permanent. 3 months, I reminded myself each morning, as I pulled on my service uniform. Just 3 months. On my 8th day, as I was struggling through a budget justification document for next-generation hoist systems, Representative Blackwood appeared in my doorway. "Walk with me, Captain," she said without preamble. I grabbed my notebook and followed her into the labyrinthine corridors. Unlike me, Blackwood moved through the Pentagon with the ease of someone who had long ago mapped its territory. Military. Personnel and civilian staff alike nodded deferentially as we passed. "You look miserable," she observed once we were alone in an elevator. I straightened. "I'm adjusting, ma'am." "Of course you are. You're used to making split-second decisions that directly impact lives. Now you're writing memos that might influence policy in 2 years." She gave me a sidelong glance. Quite the transition. I didn't know how to respond without sounding ungrateful or unprofessional, so I said nothing. The elevator doors opened to the inner courtyard. 5 acres of green space surrounded by the Pentagon's 5 concentric rings. The June air was thick, with humidity, but after days under artificial light, I welcomed the heat. "I brought you here for a reason, Captain," Blackwood said as we walked across the courtyard. "And it wasn't to bury you in paperwork." "With all due respect, ma'am, that seems to be exactly what's happening," she laughed. "Fair enough, but necessary groundwork. You can't change a system you don't understand." She gestured to a bench in the shade of a maple tree, and we sat. "Next week, the subcommittee begins preliminary hearings on the Defense Appropriations Bill. I want you to testify." I blinked. "About what, exactly?" "About why Congress should prioritize funding for advanced medevac operations. About what it's really like out there, beyond the sanitized briefings and statistical reports." Her expression grew serious. "About why the system we currently have isn't good enough." My pulse quickened. "You want me to criticize current military protocols in a congressional hearing?" "I want you to tell the truth," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Not in the military," I said bluntly. Blackwood studied me. "Let me tell you what I see, Captain. I see a decorated officer who has repeatedly risked her life to save others. I see someone who understands both the technology and the human element of modern warfare. And yes, I see someone who is willing to land a military helicopter on her father's lawn to make a point." She smiled slightly. "That last one suggests you're not afraid to take calculated risks when necessary." "Landing in Westport was personal," I said. "This is different." "Is it?" She leaned forward. "From what I understand, you filed multiple after-action reports recommending equipment upgrades that were never implemented. You've suggested protocol changes that were dismissed by officers who haven't seen combat in years. You've watched good soldiers suffer or die because the system is too slow to adapt." Her eyes held mine. "Tell me that's not personal." The words hit with uncomfortable precision. I thought of Martinez patching the hydraulic line on our last deployment with equipment that should have been replaced years ago. The sergeant we'd lost in Afghanistan because our night vision systems couldn't distinguish between rocky terrain and a flat landing zone. The countless small inefficiencies and outdated protocols that accumulated into life or death consequences. "What exactly would you want me to say?" I asked finally. "The truth," she repeated. "Your truth, not the official line. The subcommittee needs to hear from someone with dirt under their fingernails, not just stars on their shoulders." A group of junior officers walked past, their conversation falling quiet as they recognized Representative Blackwood. She nodded to them, then turned back to me. "You have the weekend to think about it," she said. "The hearing is Tuesday at 10 WOW. If you decide to participate, I'll have the necessary clearances arranged." She stood, smoothing her jacket. "And, Captain? Sometimes the most important missions don't involve flying a helicopter." I watched her walk back toward the building, her words echoing in my head. By the time I returned to my claustrophobic office, my inbox had filled with more requests for revisions to documents I barely understood the purpose of. I stared at the screen, feeling the distance between this world and the one I knew growing, wider by the hour. That evening, I called Martinez from my apartment in Arlington. The connection was scratchy. She was at a training exercise in upstate New York, but her voice grounded me immediately. "How's life among the paper pushers, Captain?" she asked, the familiar teasing in her tone a balm to my frayed nerves. "About as exciting as watching paint dry," I admitted. "I'd rather be flying night exercises in a thunderstorm." "That bad, huh?" She paused. "The unit misses you. Rodriguez is good, but he's not you." I felt a pang of something like homesickness. "How's Mercy 1? "Temperamental," she said. "The new hydraulic line keeps slipping. Maintenance says they've fixed it, but it happens again every third flight." "Did you use the old gasket trick I showed you?" "Tried it. Works for about 6 hours, then we're back to square one." Frustration edged her voice. "The parts we need are on eternal back order. Budget freeze, apparently." I thought of the appropriations Bill Blackwood had mentioned, the hearings that might determine whether units like mine got the equipment they needed. "Martinez," I said slowly, "if you were sitting in front of a room full of congresspeople who control the military budget, what would you tell them?" "That's easy," she replied without hesitation. "I'd tell them to get off their asses and into the field. See what it's really like trying to save lives with equipment from the last decade and protocols written by people who've never flown in. A hot zone." I smiled despite myself. "Just like that?" "Well, I'd probably clean up the language a bit," she conceded. "Why? They sending you to Congress?" "Something like that," I said. "Blackwood wants me to testify about medevac operations. Tell the real story, as she puts it." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "You gonna do it?" "I don't know. It feels like career suicide," she finished for me. "Maybe. Or at least a complication I don't need." "With all due respect, Captain, that's bullshit." I sat up straighter, surprised by her bluntness. "Sorry," she continued, not sounding sorry at all. "But you didn't hesitate to land on your father's lawn to make him see who you really are. Why hesitate to tell Congress what they need to hear to make sure we can do our jobs properly? Put that way, it seemed so simple." "There could be repercussions," I said, though the argument sounded weak even to my own ears. "There are always repercussions." "For doing the right thing," Martinez replied. "You taught me that, Captain." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony watching the lights of aircraft moving across the darkening sky. Commercial flights following their predetermined paths into and out of Reagan National. So different from the flights I was used to, the improvised routes and rapid adjustments of combat aviation. By the time I went to bed, I had made my decision. The next morning, I called Representative Blackwood's office and told her aide I would testify. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. I spent hours compiling statistics, reviewing incident reports, organizing my thoughts. This wasn't just about equipment failures or outdated protocols. It was about the human cost of bureaucratic inertia, the lives affected when policies didn't keep pace with reality. Tuesday morning arrived clear and hot. I dressed in my full-service uniform, the ribbons and insignia telling a story of their own. As I fastened my hair into a regulation bun, I caught myself in the mirror, Captain Olivia Reeves, about to address members of Congress. I wondered what my father would think if he could see me now, testifying before the very people he had cultivated as clients and connections throughout his business career. The hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined, wood-paneled and formal with the committee members seated on a raised dais at the front. Representative Blackwood nodded to me as I took my seat at the witness table, a small gesture of encouragement. "The Subcommittee on Defense Appropriations will now hear testimony regarding medical evacuation operations and funding priorities," the chairman announced. "Our first witness is Captain Olivia Reeves, currently attached to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but previously commander of the 424th Medical Evacuation Company, based at Fort Belvoir." I leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackwood, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. The prepared statement I'd written felt suddenly inadequate, too sanitized. For what needed to be said, I set it aside and looked directly at the committee members. I've spent the past 8 years flying medevac missions in the most dangerous areas of operation our military serves in, I began. I've evacuated wounded soldiers under enemy fire, navigated sandstorms with failing equipment, and made life-or-death decisions that no training manual fully prepares you for. The room was utterly silent, all eyes on me. What I want to convey today isn't just a list of equipment needs or protocol adjustments, though I have those too. What I want you to understand is the reality on the ground, or rather, in the air, for the men and women who perform these missions. I described the missions most civilians would never hear about. The night extractions where we flew without lights to avoid enemy fire. The landings on terrain so unstable we could feel the helicopter sinking as we loaded casualties. The critical minutes spent rigging makeshift solutions when equipment failed at the worst possible moments. 2 years ago, during an extraction, near Kunduz, my crew chief had to repair a hydraulic line in flight using parts from her personal toolkit and a gasket we had salvaged from a previous mission, I told them. The replacement part had been on order for 6 months. If she hadn't improvised that repair, we would have lost hydraulic control and likely crashed with 3 critically wounded soldiers on board. I glanced at Representative Blackwood, who gave me a slight nod of encouragement. This isn't about assigning blame, I continued. It's about recognizing that the gap between what we ask these crews to do and what we equip them to do is growing wider. When we talk about appropriations, we're not just talking about budget lines and fiscal years. We're talking about whether a soldier with a battlefield injury gets evacuated in time to save their life, or whether a helicopter crew has the equipment they need to complete their mission safely. For the next hour, I answered questions from the committee members, some supportive, others skeptical or openly hostile. One congressman from a district with a major defense contractor seemed particularly concerned with my criticism of current equipment procurement practices. "Captain Reeves," he said, his tone condescending, "are you suggesting that our military procurement officers don't know how to select appropriate equipment?" "No, sir," I replied evenly. "I'm suggesting that the people who actually use the equipment in combat conditions should have more input into the selection process. And you believe your experience qualifies you to make broad recommendations about multi-million-dollar procurement decisions?" he pressed. I met his gaze directly. "With respect, Congressman, my experience keeping soldiers alive with inadequate equipment absolutely qualifies me to tell you what works and what doesn't. The question is whether this committee believes that first-hand experience has value." A murmur ran through the gallery. The congressman's face reddened, but before he could respond, Representative Blackwood intervened. "Captain Reeves isn't here to defend her qualifications, which are exceptional," she said firmly. "She's here to provide critical insight that this committee rarely has access to. I suggest we focus on the substance of her testimony rather than questioning why we should listen to her at all." The chairman nodded. "Agreed. Captain, please continue." By the time the hearing concluded, I had spoken longer and more candidly than I'd intended. I had named specific equipment failures, criticized procurement processes, and highlighted the disconnect between Pentagon policy and battlefield reality. I had crossed lines I'd been taught never to cross as a military officer, and I didn't regret a word of it. As I gathered my notes, Representative Blackwood approached the witness table. "Well done, Captain," she said quietly. "That's exactly what they needed to hear." "I'm not sure my commanding officers will agree," I replied, though I felt lighter than I had in weeks. "Leave that to me." She smiled. "Check your phone." I did, finding dozens of messages and missed calls. The first was from Martinez. "Watching the live stream. You're killing it, Captain." The second, surprisingly, was from my brother Andrew. "Just saw you on C-SPAN." Dad's speechless for once. "Call when you can." And the third, from Colonel Jenkins. "Bold move, Reeves. We'll discuss when you return. but off the record, damn good testimony. I looked up to find Blackwood watching me, satisfaction evident in her expression. See, the truth has a way of finding allies. As we walked out of the hearing room, reporters clustered in the hallway called out questions. Blackwood steered me past them with practiced ease. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The appropriations process takes months, but you've made an impression that won't be forgotten." She paused at the building exit. "And, Captain, I think you've found your voice in this world too. Different from the cockpit, but no less powerful." I thought about that as I drove back to the Pentagon, the Washington Monument gleaming in the distance. I had spent years seeking validation in my parents' world, then years building my identity in the military, always keeping those realms separate. Today, for the first time, I had brought them together, speaking truth to power in a language both worlds could understand. My phone rang again. This time, it was a number I recognized but hadn't seen in weeks. My father. I hesitated, then answered. "Olivia," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of authority and restraint. "I saw your testimony." I waited, unsure what would follow. "It was impressive," he said finally. "You spoke with conviction." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full acknowledgement of everything that had happened between us. But coming from Richard Reeves, it was something close to respect. "Thank you," I said simply. "Your mother and I are in D.C. next weekend for a fundraiser at the Kennedy Center," he continued. "Perhaps we could have dinner." I thought about declining, about maintaining the distance I'd established. But something had shifted inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a new certainty about who I was and what I valued. "I'd like that," I said. "There's a place near the Pentagon. Nothing fancy, but the officers swear by it." "Not the kind of restaurant we usually frequent," he said, a hint of his old judgment creeping in. "No," I agreed. "But it's my world, Dad. Maybe it's time you saw it." The silence that followed wasn't tense or angry. It was thoughtful. "That sounds appropriate," he said finally. "After all, you've certainly seen ours, from above." I found myself smiling at the unexpected touch of humor. "I'll send you the details." After we hung up, I stood for a moment in the Pentagon parking lot, watching military helicopters moving across the sky above the Potomac. 3 months ago, I had been flying one of those helicopters, certain of my path but still seeking validation. Now I was standing on the ground, navigating new territory, but finally, truly visible. Not just to my parents, but to the people whose decisions affected crews like mine every day. Different altitude, same mission, making sure the people who mattered could see what really counted. The Officers' Club near the Pentagon wasn't elegant by Westport standards. No crystal chandeliers, no white tablecloths, no sommelier hovering with wine recommendations. Just solid wood tables, subdued lighting, and photographs of military operations covering the walls. I'd chosen it deliberately, neutral ground that leaned toward my territory. I arrived early, selecting a corner table where we could talk without being overheard. The dinner with my parents wasn't something I'd mentioned to anyone at the Pentagon. It felt too fragile, too uncertain to share. My father arrived first, precisely on time as always. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my housing allowance, but he'd left off his usual cufflinks and pocket square. A concession to the environment, I realized. A small gesture, but one I hadn't expected. "Olivia," he said, extending his hand as if we were meeting for a business lunch. I shook it, noting the familiar firmness of his grip. "Dad, thanks for coming." He glanced around, taking in the bar where officers in uniform mingled, the framed unit insignias on the walls, the casual atmosphere. Interesting place. Coming from him, it wasn't exactly praise, but it wasn't criticism either. Progress, of a sort. "Where's Mom?" I asked as he sat. "She'll be here shortly. She had a call with the contractor about the pool house renovations." He picked up the menu, studying it with the same concentration he'd once given to investment portfolios. "What do you recommend?" "The steak is good," I said. "So is the burger, actually. Not exactly the cuisine you're used to, but honest food." He nodded, still scanning the options. "Your testimony was quite something." I stiffened slightly, unsure if this was the start of critique. "It was the truth." "Yes," he said, looking up from the menu. "That's what made it compelling. You didn't sound like the military officers I usually encounter at fundraisers, all carefully curated talking points and diplomatic non-answers." Before I could respond, my mother arrived in a flurry of expensive perfume and apologies about traffic. She wore a simple black dress that managed to look elegant without being ostentatious. Her silver hair swept up in a style that had probably taken an hour to perfect. She hesitated before leaning in for the briefest of air kisses near my cheek. "Olivia, you look well." It was the same greeting she'd given me at the anniversary party, but something in her tone was different, less dismissive, more assessing. Her eyes took in my uniform, the captain's bars, the ribbons that meant nothing to her but somehow seemed to register now. "Thanks, Mom. You too." She slid into the chair my father held for her posture perfect as always. "This is where you come often." "Not this specific place," I said. "But places like it, yes. Military life isn't all barracks and mess halls." "Clearly," she murmured, her gaze moving around the room, lingering on a group of officers laughing near the bar. "It's more convivial than I expected." A server approached, a young woman with a military bearing who recognized my uniform immediately. "Evening, Captain. Can I get you and your guests started with drinks?" "I'll have the usual," I said, oddly comforted by being known here. "And whatever my parents would like." My father ordered a scotch, neat. My mother, a glass of white wine. The conversation stalled as we studied menus and avoided the weight of everything unsaid. When our drinks arrived, beer for me in a chilled glass, my father raised his scotch slightly. "To your successful testimony," he said. The senators seemed impressed. I clinked my glass against his, surprised by the gesture. "Representatives, actually, it was a House subcommittee." "Ah." He nodded, filing away the correction. "Politicians all look the same to me." "Richard," my mother admonished softly, but I caught the hint of a smile. "How long will you be in D.C.?" I asked, steering toward neutral territory. "Just the weekend," my mother replied. "The Kennedy Center event is tomorrow, then we fly back Sunday. Your father has board meetings Monday." "And you?" I asked. "Still chairing the hospital fundraiser?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face. That I knew, that I'd asked. "Yes, actually. We're focusing on the new pediatric oncology wing this year." I nodded. "Important work." "Yes," she hesitated. "Not unlike yours, I suppose. Different contexts, but both about saving lives. It was the closest thing to a bridge she'd ever extended." I felt something shift between us. Not forgiveness or reconciliation exactly, but a tentative reaching across the gulf that had separated us for so long. "Different contexts," I agreed. "But yes, same ultimate goal." My father cleared his throat. "Andrew mentioned you might be staying in Washington after your temporary assignment. Something about a position with the Armed Services Committee?" News traveled fast in certain circles. "It's a possibility," I said carefully. "Representative Blackwood has suggested I might be valuable as a military liaison. Nothing's decided yet." "But you're considering it," he said, neither question nor judgment in his tone. "I am," I admitted. "It would mean leaving active flight status, at least temporarily. That's a big decision." My mother's eyes met mine. "It sounds like an important role." "It could be," I agreed. "A chance to make changes that affect more than just my unit. But it means trading the cockpit for conference rooms? I smiled slightly. Not exactly what I trained for. Sometimes the most meaningful work happens away from the front lines, my father said unexpectedly, where policy is made. Coming from the man who'd once dismissed my entire career as a phase, it was a startling acknowledgement. I studied him, trying to reconcile this person with the father who had publicly declared me his greatest disappointment just weeks ago. That's what Blackwood says, I replied. I'm still weighing my options. Our food arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. As we ate, the topics turned lighter. Andrew's twins starting preschool, the renovations at their Westport house, neutral subjects that required no vulnerability from any of us. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even really understanding. But it was something we hadn't had before, a meal without judgment, a conversation without underlying currents of disappointment. As we were finishing, my father set down his fork with careful precision. "Olivia," he said, his voice taking on that boardroom gravity I remembered from childhood, "I owe you an apology." I froze, my water glass halfway to my lips. "What I said at the anniversary party was inexcusable," he continued. "Regardless of our differences, it was wrong to speak about you that way, especially in front of others." My mother placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of support I hadn't expected. "We both owe you an apology," she said quietly. "We've been rigid in our expectations." I set down my glass carefully, buying time as I processed their words. An apology from Richard and Catherine Reeves was unprecedented territory. "Thank you," I said finally. "That means a lot." I paused, then added, "I'm not sorry about the helicopter, though." My father's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "I wouldn't expect you to be. It was effective. Your father had to explain to the Whitmores that his daughter was conducting an authorized military exercise," my mother said, unexpected humor in her voice. "Cynthia Whitmore is still talking about it at the club." "I imagine she is," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "The lawn service had to resod that entire section," my father added. "The downdraft from your, what do you call it? Rotor wash? I supplied." "Yes, that. It tore up the grass down to the dirt." He shook his head, but there was something close to admiration in his expression. "You certainly made your point." "I learned from the best," I said, meeting his gaze. "You always," said presentation matters. For the first time in my adult life, I heard my father laugh. A genuine laugh, not the calculated chuckle he used at business functions. "Touché, Olivia. Touché." 2 years have passed since that dinner at the officers' club. 2 years since I traded my flight suit for business attire, my cockpit for committee rooms. I accepted Representative Blackwood's offer to become the military liaison to the Armed Services Committee, initially as a 1-year assignment that has since been extended twice. The work is different from flying, less adrenaline, more patience, required, but the impact reaches further than I ever imagined. The appropriations bill we fought for passed, with substantial increases for medevac units across all branches. New equipment procurement protocols now require input from active duty personnel with recent deployment experience. Training programs have been updated. Lives have been saved by changes made on paper instead of in the air. Martinez emails me regularly with updates from the field. "The new hoists actually work in a sandstorm," she wrote last month. Imagine that. She's a warrant officer now, on track to commission as an officer herself. We meet for drinks whenever her training brings her to DC, trading stories about our different worlds. My relationship with my parents has evolved into something I never expected. Not closeness exactly, but a cautious, mutual respect. They've visited DC 3 times since that first dinner. My father has stopped suggesting more appropriate career paths. My mother has started asking genuine questions about my work. At Christmas, She even displayed a framed photograph of me standing beside my Black Hawk in their formal living room, right next to Andrew's family portrait. Small steps, but significant ones. Today, I'm standing in the White House Rose Garden, waiting for the ceremony to begin. The sun is warm on my face, the air fragrant with spring blooms. I've worn my full dress uniform for the occasion, ribbons and medals telling the story of my service. Captain Reeves. I turn to see Representative Blackwood approaching, elegant as always in a tailored navy suit. Congresswoman, thank you for the invitation, she smiles. You earned this. Your work on the committee has been exceptional. The president specifically requested your presence when he signs the Military Readiness Act. Behind her, I spot my parents, making their way through the crowd of dignitaries and military personnel. My father in one of his immaculate suits, my mother in a cream-colored dress and pearls. They look out of place and perfectly at ease simultaneously, a skill perfected through decades of navigating elite social circles. Olivia, my mother calls, reaching me first. She embraces me briefly, still somewhat stiff but genuinely warm. You look wonderful. My father extends his hand, then changes his mind and pulls me into an awkward but sincere hug. Congratulations, Captain, he says formally, but his eyes convey a pride I never thought I'd see. I'm glad you could make it, I tell them both. This wouldn't have happened without your support. It's true, in a way I never anticipated. After our reconciliation dinner, my father had quietly made calls to several representatives from Connecticut, old golf partners, former clients, urging them to support the legislation I was working on. My mother had organized a fundraiser in Westport for veterans' medical care, inviting me to speak about medevac operations to an audience of potential donors. Different worlds, beginning to overlap. The ceremony begins, all proper protocol and carefully crafted speeches. I stand at attention as the president signs the bill that will transform military medical evacuation capabilities for years to come, ensuring that crews like mine have the equipment and training they need to bring wounded warriors home. Afterward, as the crowd mingles at the reception, I find myself standing between worlds again, representatives and senators on one side, military officers on the other, my parents somewhere in between. But this time, I don't feel torn between them. I've built a bridge that allows me to move comfortably in both spaces. Captain Reeves, calls a familiar voice. I turn to see Colonel Jenkins, now General Jenkins, approaching with Martinez beside him. She looks crisp and professional in her dress uniform, a far cry from the grease-stained flight suit I remember. General Warrant Officer Martinez, I greet them, smiling. Welcome to Washington. Glad to be here, Jenkins says. The Air Medical Transport Command sends its thanks for your work on this bill. Your recommendations have already been implemented in 3 combat zones. Just doing my job, sir, I reply. Not your job, Martinez corrects with a grin. Your mission. She's right. Whether in a helicopter or a hearing room, the mission remains the same, doing everything possible to ensure that those who serve return home safely. My parents approach, and I make introductions. To my surprise, my father and Jenkins immediately fall into conversation about military logistics, finding common ground in supply chain management of all things. My mother asks Martinez thoughtful questions about her career path, listening with genuine interest to her answers. Your crew here is quite impressive, my mother says to me quietly as the others chat. I can see why you've chosen this life. It chose me, I reply. But I'm grateful it did. Later, as the reception winds down, I find a quiet moment alone with my father on the terrace overlooking the rose garden. He seems contemplative, watching the military officers and politicians mingling below. You know, he says finally, when you were born, I had a very specific vision for your life. Harvard, law school, perhaps politics or finance. I nod, having heard versions of this before. I never imagined this, he continues, gesturing to the gathering. You in uniform, influencing national policy, respected by generals and representatives, alike. He turns to me, his expression more open than I've ever seen it. I was wrong, Olivia. Your path has led you further than mine ever could have. The admission costs him something. I can see it in the tightness around his eyes, the slight flexing of his jaw. Richard Reeves does not admit mistakes easily, but he's trying, and that matters. Thank you, I say simply. That means a lot. He clears his throat. Your mother and I are thinking of having a party when you come to Westport next month. Nothing elaborate, just family and a few close friends. To celebrate your work on this legislation. I'd like that, I tell him, genuinely surprised and touched by the gesture. Perhaps, he adds with the hint of a smile, you could arrive by helicopter again. Make a proper entrance this time. I laugh, the sound carrying across the terrace. I think once was enough, Dad. Some points only need to be made once. True enough, he agrees. Though I must admit, watching the Whitmores duck as you landed was quite satisfying. They've always been insufferably smug about their children. It's the closest we'll ever come to acknowledging the full circle of our journey. From his public disappointment to his growing pride. From my desperate need for validation to my confident independence. As we rejoin the reception, I catch sight of myself reflected in one of the White House windows, Captain Olivia Reeves in full uniform, standing tall on her own terms. Not despite my parents' expectations, but beyond them. Not running from my past, but incorporating it into the woman I've become. 2 years ago, when I landed that Black Hawk on my parents' perfect lawn, I was trying to force them to see me. What I didn't realize then was that I was also learning to see myself, not through their eyes, but through my own. To recognize my value not in their approval, but in the lives I'd touched, the missions I'd completed, the differences I'd made. That revelation, more than any congressional testimony or presidential ceremony, has been the real achievement. Later, that evening, I call Martinez from my apartment. How'd it feel seeing your work become law? She asks. Different from flying, I admit. Less immediate rush, more lasting impact. But good. Really good. So you're staying in D.C.? There's no judgment in her question, just curiosity. I think about it for a moment. For now. There's more work to do here. But I haven't given up my flight status. I still log hours when I can. Once. A pilot, always a pilot, she says approvingly. What about you? Still fixing helicopters mid-flight with chewing gum and paper clips, she laughs. Haven't had to since your bill passed. The new equipment actually works. Imagine that, I echo her earlier email. After we hang up, I step out onto my balcony. The night is clear, the Washington Monument illuminated against the dark sky. In the distance, I can see aircraft lights moving steadily along their routes, fixed wing, planes following orderly paths, and occasionally, the distinctive pattern of helicopter navigation lights dancing more freely between them. Different aircraft, different missions, different altitudes, all necessary, all valuable, all part of the same sky. I think about the journey that brought me here, from the little girl who dreamed of flying while her parents plotted Ivy League applications, to the cadet struggling to prove herself at West Point, to the pilot who commanded respect in the air, to the officer who landed a helicopter on her parents' lawn to make them see her worth. I no longer need to land dramatically. To be seen, I've learned that true visibility comes not from dramatic gestures, but from consistent action, from showing up authentically day after day, from doing the work that matters regardless of who notices. My parents see me now, not perfectly, not completely, but more truly than I ever thought possible. More importantly, I see myself clearly, without the distortion of their expectations or my reactions to them. That clarity is worth more than any congressional testimony, any military decoration, any parental approval. It's the real victory I claimed that day on their manicured lawn, though I didn't recognize it then. When I look up at the helicopters moving across the DC skyline now, I don't feel the desperate need to be in the cockpit to prove my worth. I know my value, whether I'm flying missions or shaping policy that saves lives. The uniform doesn't make the soldier. The helicopter doesn't make the pilot. The approval doesn't make the person. You do. If you're watching this and feeling unseen, by family, by colleagues, by a world that tries to define you by its limited expectations, remember this. Sometimes you have to land a helicopter on someone's lawn to make them see you. But ultimately, the person who most needs to recognize your true worth is yourself. That's the real message I wanted to share with you today. That's why I landed that Blackhawk on my parents' perfect anniversary party. Not just to show them who I was, but to show myself who I had become. If you've enjoyed this story, please hit the subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. We all have our own helicopters to land, our own points to make, our own paths to forge. Sometimes knowing you're not alone in that journey makes all the difference. This is Captain Olivia Reeves, signing off. Fly high, land with purpose, and never forget your own worth, no matter who fails to see it.